Let me ask you something. If I told you that the single most powerful thing you could do right now, more than any diet, more than any supplement, more than almost any medical intervention, was lift heavy things a few times a week, would you believe me? Probably not, and I get that. Because for decades we've been fed this idea that after 40, your body is essentially in a slow, graceful decline, that you should start being careful, that you should switch to yoga and long walks and leave the weights to the 20-year-olds. And I'm here to tell you that idea is not just wrong, it's dangerous. It's the kind of thinking that quietly steals a decade of your life. I've spent the better part of my career obsessing over one question: what does it actually take to live not just a long life, but a good one? To be the person at 80 who can still get up off the floor without help, still carry their grandkids, still hike a mountain, still live on their own terms. And when you dig into that question seriously, when you look at the data without any agenda, one thing rises to the top every single time: muscle. Strength. The ability to generate force, not cardio, not flexibility, not mindfulness, though those things matter too. But if you had to pick one lever that does the most work for your long-term health and functional independence, it's resistance training. And today I want to walk you through exactly why that is, and more importantly, exactly how to do it right when you're 40, 50, 60, and beyond. Before we get into the how, we need to understand the why, because I think most people, even people who do work out, dramatically underestimate what's actually at stake here. So let's talk about something called sarcopenia. It's a word most people have never heard, even though it's quietly one of the most consequential things happening inside their body. Sarcopenia is the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength. It begins somewhere around your mid-30s, and if you do nothing to fight it, you can lose somewhere between 3 and 5% of your muscle mass per decade. And that number accelerates as you get older. By the time many people reach their 70s and 80s, they've lost so much muscle that simple tasks become genuinely dangerous. Getting up from a chair, climbing stairs, catching yourself when you stumble. These things require strength, and when that strength is gone, the consequences are severe. Falls are one of the leading causes of death in people over 65. Not because falling itself is necessarily fatal, but because when a frail person falls, they often break a hip. And a hip fracture in an older adult has a 1-year mortality rate that rivals some cancers. This is not a scare tactic, this is just what the data shows. And the deeply frustrating thing is that so much of this is preventable. Sarcopenia is not an inevitable fate. It's a disease of disuse. It's what happens when we stop giving our muscles a reason to exist. Oh, now here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something I think about a lot. The reason strength training matters so much for longevity isn't just about muscle mass in isolation. It's about what muscle does for the rest of your biology. Muscle is the largest glucose disposal organ in your body. When you have more muscle, your insulin sensitivity improves, meaning your body is better at managing blood sugar, which has downstream effects on everything from cardiovascular risk to cognitive function to cancer risk. Muscle produces what are called myokines, signaling molecules that have anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects. Some researchers have started calling skeletal muscle an endocrine organ in its own right because of how powerfully it communicates with the rest of the body. And grip strength, which is really just a proxy for overall muscular fitness, is one of the best predictors of all cause mortality we have. better in many studies than blood pressure, better than cholesterol. Think about that for a second. The strength of your hand grip predicts how long you're going to live with remarkable accuracy. Not because grip strength itself is the mechanism, but because it reflects the overall state of your musculoskeletal system. So the case is overwhelming. Strength training isn't a nice to have. It isn't just for aesthetics or for athletes. It is, I would argue, the most important form of medicine that most people are not taking. And now let's talk about what that actually looks like in practice, because the information out there is confusing, contradictory, and often built for 25-year-olds trying to maximize their bench press. What I want to give you today is a framework built specifically for someone over 40 whose goal is to still be thriving at 80. The first thing we need to establish is what I call your training philosophy. And the core of that philosophy when you're training for longevity is this: you are training for the long game. Your goal is not to maximize performance in any single workout. Your goal is to accumulate decades of consistent, progressive training without getting hurt. This sounds simple, but it fundamentally changes how you approach everything. The biggest enemy of the long-term exerciser isn't laziness, it's injury. One bad injury can knock you out for months, sometimes permanently alter your mechanics, and break the habit entirely. So every decision you make in the gym should be filtered through this question: is this sustainable? Can I do this for the next 30 years? With that philosophy in mind, let's talk about the actual structure of a training routine. I want to walk you through what I believe is the most effective approach, and then we're going to go deep on each component. The foundation of any good strength program is built around compound movements. These are exercises that involve multiple joints and multiple muscle groups working together simultaneously. Think of the squat, the hip hinge, which includes deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts, the horizontal push like a bench press or push up, the horizontal pull like a row, the vertical push like an overhead press, and the vertical pull like a pull up or lat pull down. These 6 movement patterns cover the entire body, and they replicate the actual demands of real life in a way that isolation exercises simply don't. When you pick something up off the floor, that's a hip hinge. When you push open a heavy door, that's a horizontal push. When you climb out of a pool or pull yourself up, that's a vertical pull. Training these patterns isn't just building muscle, it's building capacity for life. Now I want to spend some time on frequency and volume, because this is where a lot of people get it wrong in both directions. Some people are doing way too much, beating themselves up 6 days a week, never fully recovering, accumulating fatigue and gradually grinding their joints down. And other people are doing far too little, hitting each muscle group once every 10 days and wondering why they're not making progress. For most people over 40, training each major muscle group 2 to 3 times per week is the sweet spot. That's enough stimulus to drive adaptation and growth, and it allows adequate recovery time between sessions. In terms of sets and reps, I like to think in terms of weekly volume, the total number of challenging sets you do for each muscle group across the week. Research suggests that somewhere between 10 and 20 sets per muscle group per week is the productive range for hypertrophy and strength development. For someone just getting started or returning after a long break, start at the lower end of that range. 10 to 12 sets per week per major muscle group is plenty. As your fitness develops over months and years, you can gradually push that up. But more is not always better, and the dose-response relationship eventually inverts. At some point, more volume starts hurting more than it helps. For rep ranges, I want you to forget the old idea that you have to lift heavy to get strong, and light weights are just for toning. That's a myth. Research over the last decade has pretty conclusively shown that a wide range of rep ranges, anywhere from 5 reps to 30 reps per set, can build muscle as long as the sets are taken close to muscular failure. What I mean by that is that the last few reps of your set should feel genuinely hard. You should be working. The stimulus for muscle growth is mechanical tension and metabolic stress, and you can create both with light weights and high reps, or heavy weights and low reps. That said, I do think there's value in working across a range. Doing some heavy work in the 3 to 6 rep range builds what we call myofibrillar density, the actual contractile proteins in the muscle fiber. And doing some moderate work in the 8 to 15 rep range develops the metabolic machinery of the muscle. Both matter. Both contribute to long-term strength and function. But here's the thing I want to emphasize specifically for people over 40, and it connects back to our core philosophy of sustainability. Your joints, your tendons, and your connective tissue do not adapt as fast as your muscles. This is a critical mismatch. When you start lifting, or when you return after a break, your muscles can get stronger remarkably quickly. Within weeks, you're feeling better, lifting more weight. But your tendons and ligaments are lagging behind. They adapt more slowly because they have a lower blood supply and a different cellular turnover rate. This means that if you push too hard too fast, you get strong muscles attached to tendons that aren't ready for the loads being placed on them, and that's how you get injured. This is why I'm a big believer in what I call ramping into intensity. Start conservative, add weight slowly. Give your connective tissue time to catch up. It feels frustrating when you have the energy and the motivation to push harder, but the injuries you avoid by being patient are worth so much more than the short-term gains you'd get by rushing. Let me now walk you through what an actual week of training might look like. And I want to be clear, this isn't the only way, and it will need to be adapted to your individual situation. But this gives you a working template. 3 days a week of resistance training works well for most people. Let's call them Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, though the specific days don't matter as long as you have at least one rest day between sessions. On each of those days, you're going to do a full body session centered around 2 or 3 of those fundamental movement patterns I mentioned. So on day 1, you might start with a squat pattern, goblet squats, leg press, or barbell back squats depending on your experience and any limitations you have. Then a horizontal push, dumbbell bench press, or a chest supported push-up variation. Then a vertical pull, lat pull down or assisted pull up. 3 to 4 sets of each, working in that 8 to 12 rep range with enough weight that the last 2 or 3 reps of each set are genuinely challenging. Add in some direct core work, not crunches, but things like dead bugs, Pallof presses, and carries, and you've got a complete session that hits every major muscle group and takes about 45 to 60 minutes. On day 2, you shift the emphasis. Start with a hip hinge, a Romanian deadlift, a trap bar deadlift, or a kettlebell swing if you enjoy that modality, then a horizontal pull, a seated cable row, a dumbbell row, or a chest-supported row machine, then a vertical push, a seated dumbbell press, or a landmine press if overhead pressing causes shoulder discomfort. Again, 3 to 4 sets, similar rep range, similar level of effort. Day 3, you can rotate the patterns again, maybe adding in some single leg work, split squats, step-ups, single leg Romanian deadlifts? Because unilateral training is incredibly valuable for balance, for correcting asymmetries, and for joint health. It also tends to be easier on the spine than heavy bilateral loading. Between those 3 strength days, I want you to think about your activity the other days. This is not nothing. 2 to 3 sessions of what I call Zone 2 cardio per week. Steady, state aerobic work, where you're working hard enough that you can still hold a conversation, but not easily. This is foundational for cardiovascular health and metabolic function. And 1 session of higher intensity interval work, something like 4 to 6 rounds of hard effort with recovery in between. The strength work and the cardio work together. They are not opposing forces. They are complementary pillars of the same structure. Now I want to spend some time talking about things that are specifically relevant to the over 40 body that I don't think get enough attention. The first is recovery. Recovery is not the absence of training. Recovery is active, and it matters enormously. Sleep is the most powerful recovery tool you have. If you are sleeping 6 hours or less, you are dramatically limiting the adaptation you get from training. Muscle protein synthesis, the process by which your muscles repair and grow after training, is heavily concentrated during deep sleep. Growth hormone, which plays a critical role in tissue repair, is secreted primarily during slow wave sleep. When you short-change your sleep, you short-change your results, full stop. 7 to 9 hours is the target, not as a luxury, but as a biological requirement. Nutrition is the other recovery pillar I want to address. And the single most important nutritional factor for building and maintaining muscle is protein intake. I know this gets beaten to death, but the research is remarkably consistent. Most people over 40 are not eating enough protein to support muscle retention and growth. General population guidelines recommend about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, but for active individuals trying to build or maintain muscle, especially as they age, the evidence supports something closer to 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. And here's the thing about aging specifically: older muscle is less sensitive to the anabolic signal from protein, meaning you need more protein per meal to stimulate the same amount of muscle protein synthesis compared to a younger person. This is sometimes called anabolic resistance, and it's a real phenomenon. The practical implication is that you need to make sure you're hitting your protein targets consistently, distributing it across meals rather than loading it all in one sitting, and prioritizing high-quality, complete protein sources, animal proteins, dairy, eggs, and for plant-based eaters, carefully combined plant proteins or a leucine-rich protein supplement. Leucine, specifically, is worth mentioning because it acts as a trigger for the muscle-building pathway. You need somewhere around 2 to 3 grams of leucine per meal to robustly activate MTR and kick off muscle protein synthesis. A good-sized serving of most animal proteins will get you there. If you're relying on plant proteins, you may need to be more deliberate about hitting that leucine threshold. Let me also talk about progressive overload, because this is the fundamental mechanism by which strength training works, and it's often poorly understood. Progressive overload simply means that over time, you need to keep increasing the demand you place on your muscles. Your body adapts to the stress you give it. And once it's adapted, that same stress no longer drives further improvement. You have to keep nudging the challenge upward. The most straightforward way to do this is to add weight to the bar. But that's not the only way. You can add reps. You can add sets. You can reduce rest time. You can improve the quality of movement. going deeper in a squat, pausing at the bottom of a rep, controlling the eccentric portion more deliberately. All of these represent progressive overload. What you want to avoid is going into the gym and doing the same workout with the same weights for the same reps week after week and calling that training. That is maintenance at best. And over time, it will lead to regression as your body becomes so efficient at that particular pattern that it needs very little muscle to perform it. I want to address something that comes up constantly when I talk to people in this age group, and that's pain. Specifically, the aches and joint discomfort that seem to accumulate as the years go by. And I want to be really clear about this. Not all pain is the same, and training with some degree of discomfort is normal and appropriate. But training through sharp, acute, or joint-specific pain is not. The distinction I use is this muscle soreness from training is expected and fine. A generalized ache that comes on a day or two after a hard session, that's your muscles adapting. But pain that is sharp, that is specific to a joint, that occurs during the movement itself rather than after, or that persists and worsens over time, that needs to be addressed. Sometimes that means modifying the exercise. A barbell back squat might aggravate your knees or lower back, but a goblet squat or a leg press might not. An overhead press might irritate your shoulder, but a landmine press at an angle might be pain-free. The goal is to find the version of each movement pattern that allows you to train hard without causing harm. There is almost always a modification. I also want to talk about mobility and its relationship to strength training, because I think they are far more connected than most people realize. Limited mobility in your hips, your thoracic spine, your ankles, your shoulders doesn't just make training less effective. It actually creates compensatory patterns that increase injury risk. If your hips are so tight that you can't squat to depth without your lower back rounding, then every squat you do is loading your spine in a compromised position. Over hundreds and thousands of reps, those compensations become problems. This is why I recommend spending time on mobility work, not just as a warm-up ritual, but as a serious training priority. Hip flexor stretching, thoracic rotation, ankle dorsiflexion work, shoulder mobility, these are not soft extras for people who aren't tough enough to do real training. They are prerequisites for safe, effective, long-term strength training. 15 to 20 minutes a few times a week, consistently practiced, will pay dividends for decades. Now I want to address something more psychological, because I think it's one of the most underappreciated factors in long-term training success, and that's identity. How do you see yourself? Because here's what I've observed over years of working with patients. The people who maintain their fitness into their 70s and 80s, who are still strong and capable and mobile well past the age when most people have given up, are the people who have internalized being a physically active person as part of their identity. It's not something they do, it's something they are. And that distinction matters enormously when life gets hard, when you travel, when you're stressed, when you're sick, when motivation is nowhere to be found. The person who sees exercise as a chore they're trying to maintain will miss it when things get difficult. The person who sees it as an expression of who they are will find a way. So part of what I'd encourage you to think about is building that identity. Not through willpower or forcing yourself, but through accumulated evidence. Every time you show up, even for a shortened or imperfect session, you are casting a vote for the identity of someone who trains. And over time, those votes accumulate into something powerful. I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier. the concept of what I call the Centenarian Decathlon. This is a framework I find really useful for thinking about training goals. Instead of training for the gym, train for the life you want to be living at 80 and beyond. What specific physical abilities do you need to maintain? The ability to climb 2 flights of stairs without losing your breath. The ability to carry groceries with both arms. The ability to get off the floor without using your hands. The ability to hike 3 miles with mild elevation. The ability to pick up a young child. Whatever your specific goals are, work backwards from those. What physical capacities, strength, endurance, mobility, balance, do you need to perform those tasks at 80? And then train to build significant margin above that requirement today, because you know that capacity will decline somewhat. The goal isn't just to barely maintain function. The goal is to have so much reserve that even with some age-related loss, you are still well above the threshold that matters. Balance and stability deserve their own mention here because they tend to decline significantly with age, and they are so directly connected to fall risk. Single leg balance work, exercises that challenge your proprioception and your neuromuscular control should be a regular part of your routine. This doesn't need to be elaborate. Standing on one leg while brushing your teeth, single leg deadlifts, step ups with a controlled pause at the top, balance board work. These things seem almost trivially simple, but the neural pathways that govern balance are trainable, and they respond to practice just like strength does. Let me also say something about the role of a coach or trainer, because I think there's a lot of resistance to this in the fitness space. People feel like they should be able to figure it out on their own, or that hiring someone is admitting you don't know what you're doing. But working with a skilled coach, at least initially, is one of the highest return investments you can make. Not because the programming is so complex you can't learn it, but because technique matters enormously in strength training, and it's very hard to see your own movement from the outside. A deadlift with poor mechanics done 1,000 times is doing damage, not building fitness. A few months with someone who can teach you to move well, who can give you real-time feedback, who can help you calibrate your effort level appropriately, that foundation will serve you for the rest of your life. I also want to be honest about something, because I think the fitness world has a real problem with overselling. You will not transform your body in 12 weeks. You will not add 20 pounds of muscle in a year. The adaptations from strength training are real and significant, but they are gradual. Consistent training over months and years produces remarkable results. Consistent training for 3 weeks, then stopping, then starting again, then stopping, that produces frustration. The biggest predictor of where you will be physically at 65, at 70, at 80 is not what program you follow or what supplements you take. It's whether you show up week after week, year after year. Consistency is everything. And this is another reason why sustainability is the North Star of your programming decisions. The perfect program that you can't stick to is worse than the imperfect program that becomes a lifetime habit. Let me talk briefly about one thing that I think is underutilized and incredibly valuable for people in this age group, and that's the concept of training blocks or periodization. Instead of doing the same program indefinitely, organizing your training into distinct phases that emphasize different qualities allows your body to recover more fully, prevents burnout, and produces better long-term adaptation. A simple version of this might look like spending 8 to 12 weeks focused on building foundational strength with heavier loads and lower reps. then a phase of higher volume work to build muscle and improve work capacity, then perhaps a phase of more metabolic conditioning and active recovery. Cycling through these phases keeps training fresh, keeps your body responding, and gives your joints different types of stress so that you're not grinding the same structures in exactly the same way week after week for years. There's also something to be said for simply getting outside and doing physical things that you enjoy. Hiking, swimming, cycling, playing with your kids or grandkids, recreational sports. These are not separate from your training program. They are expressions of the fitness you are building. And one of the most important things I tell patients is this: the gym is where you build capacity. Life is where you spend it. The whole point of being strong and fit is to do more of the things that make life worth living. So don't get so locked into the program that you forget what the program is for. As we start to bring this together, I want to give you a clear, actionable summary of the core principles. Train each major muscle group 2 to 3 times per week with compound movements that reflect real-world demands. Use a range of rep intensities, some heavier work in the lower rep ranges, some moderate work in the mid-range. Take your sets close to failure while leaving a rep or 2 in reserve to manage fatigue and injury risk. Progress gradually and protect your connective tissue by not adding load faster than your tendons can adapt. Eat enough protein. Aim for somewhere around 1 gram per pound of body weight per day as a practical approximation, prioritizing complete protein sources. Sleep 7 to 9 hours. Layer in Zone 2 cardio 2 to 3 times per week. Address mobility proactively. Build the identity of a lifelong mover. One last thing, and then I'll leave you with this. I think there's something profound about choosing to fight for your physical future. In a culture that largely accepts physical decline as inevitable, making the decision to train, not for vanity, not for performance, but for the quality and independence of your later years, is an act of genuine self-respect. It's saying, I intend to be here and to be capable for a long time. It's one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself, and you don't have to do it perfectly. You just have to do it consistently. If this gave you something useful today, if it shifted your perspective even slightly on what's possible for your body in the decades ahead, I hope you take that energy and put it into action this week. Pick 2 or 3 of the things we talked about that you're not currently doing and start there. Not everything at once. Just start. Thank you for watching.